Think about your people. Who comes to mind? Friends who think like you? Acquaintances who speak like you? Or individuals who look like you? What makes a group your people? A shared appearance? A shared language? A shared house of worship? Or a shared set of values? In my senior year of high school, I was shopping at a bookstore for an SAT practice book with my brother. As I walked up to the counter to swipe my credit card, the associate asked if he could share some advice with my brother and me. Of course, I said yes, and he proceeded to tell us how helpful it was to read nonfiction texts and quality newspapers in preparation for the exams. I had already taken the SAT by then, so I noted that this was helpful advice, to which he smiled and responded, "You know, I may not know many words in your language, but I sure know a lot in mine." Your language? You mean English? You mean the language I scored a perfect 800 on? That's what I wanted to say. But that was not the point. The point was not how wrong his statement was, but the assumptions that led him to make it. It was that for him, my distinct appearance, my skin color, my headscarf, perhaps, was a cue that I didn't belong in his circle, the circle that spoke his language. Just last month, my dad was attending my brother's soccer game when a parent from the other team engaged him in conversation. The conversation turned to football, my dad's other religion. And midway through, the parent exclaimed, "You know, for someone with your accent, you seem to know a lot about football." I know he meant it as a compliment, but his underlying surprise unsettles me. He was surprised that someone with a supposedly foreign accent could enjoy something as quintessentially American as football. He was amazed that our pastimes could align with his own. Even friends are prone to making similar assumptions. One friend, after knowing me for a few months, one day remarked, "You know, the first time I met you, I thought you were so oppressed. But for someone who wears a headscarf, you are such a passionate advocate." Now, I know she meant it as praise, and I know I was secretly pleased that I had defied a stereotype. But what troubles me is that before I spoke, a piece of cloth spoke for me. A piece of cloth became a marker that I didn't share her freedoms or her passion. My outward appearance was enough to cast me as an outsider, enough to view me as the other, enough to assume that I couldn't share their language, their pastimes, their freedoms, or their passion. Never mind that I grew up reading every Dr. Seuss book I could lay my hands on, or that every fall Sunday is football Sunday in our family, or that my decision to wear a headscarf is a personal choice, or that my strongest aspiration is to be a passionate advocate for social change. I look different, and therefore, in the minds of many, I do not belong. I am the other. This is human instinct. To categorize and generalize based on outward characteristics is natural. We fear difference. We fear the unfamiliar. And that fear is a perfect foundation for otherization, a subconscious process where we divide the world into us versus them, into my people versus your people. And given the right circumstances, that seemingly harmless frame of reference begins to engender negative attitudes. That's prejudice. And prejudice can be the start of a perilous path. A path that transforms beliefs and attitudes into acts of injustice, into support for injustice, into silence in the face of injustice. A path that leads to blustering statements, pronouncing an entire religion of 1.6 billion fellow human beings as a vessel for hatred. A path where declarations are made on patrolling houses of worship or banning members of that same religion from a nation built on diversity. A path where each of these proposals is met with either fear, applause, or resignation. Such rise in Islamophobia is not a random anomaly. Throughout our human existence, we've succumbed to our fear of difference, only to find ourselves on an all too familiar path. We've allowed our prejudice to provoke our most regretful evils, from slavery to segregation, from terrorism to genocide. Each are the toxic fruits of the same seed of otherization. Before there was Hitler, there was social fear. Fear that the Jews were too different to assimilate. They were the other, whose beliefs were assumed to contradict the values of the majority. Before segregation and apartheid became law, there was fear, a primal fear of a different, darker skin color. Before nativist political parties bent on excluding Catholics from this country proliferated, there was fear that the Catholics were loyal only to the Pope and therefore disqualified from holding political office. Before the Japanese internment camps appeared, there was fear that 100,000 Americans, 2/3 of whom were citizens, somehow posed a national security threat. Before 9/11, there was a perversion of sacred texts by radicals determined to rationalize why people with different worldviews, people they feared, people like you and me, deserve to die. The victims and magnitudes of these moments may vary, but the premises are similar. They represent the darkest possible consequences of fear and prejudice. Today, the first chapters of those stories are not all that distant. In recent weeks, months, and years, I've heard political leaders proclaim Islam to be at war with the West, declare Muslims to be unfit for holding political office, and portray Muslim refugees as threats to the security and identity of this nation. I've seen this rhetoric begin to paint being Muslim as antithetical to being American. I've watched as the contributions of millions of American Muslim doctors, engineers, entrepreneurs, members of the military, and students are ignored by the careless sweep of a broad brush. But history is not destiny. The question is, how many times will we walk the same path of paranoia before we choose a different one? How many new others will you make the targets of our fear before we realize that different is not other? Throughout my life, I've seen the implications of different being assumed to mean other. But I've also been guilty of the same othering. Last summer, I was in Ecuador, serving with a nonprofit organization that supports Native indigenous communities in the Amazon. I was asked to help develop and facilitate a course on leadership for middle school students. Venturing across what I knew was this gap of privilege and opportunity, I remember being so eager to make an impact. But every day I walked into the classroom was a struggle. The students could barely stifle their energy to sit down. My eloquent words on leadership were promptly forgotten. But most importantly, the concepts we taught rarely connected to their actual lives. Struggling to make myself relevant, I started searching for a new path. I started asking questions for the first time. What does the community already think about leadership? What are their fundamental values? What are their needs and priorities in their words? I discovered that the community defined leadership from the perspective of the collective, not the individual. For many members of the community, the word for leadership didn't exist in their vocabulary. The closest parallel was teamwork. The word for community development didn't exist in their vocabulary. The closest parallel was equilibrium. For them, progress entailed preserving a balance between the new and the old. I was intrigued by that perspective, but I was more stunned by the fact that they even had a perspective. I started to wonder why that would shock me. And then in echoes, I heard the voice of my friend, who was shocked that I could have passion. I heard the voice of the associate, who could not fathom that English was my first language. And then I suddenly realized that I had subconsciously drawn a line between myself and the community. The indigenous community became my other. The apparent difference in background became a reason for me to imagine all sorts of differences that simply didn't exist. I thought they live less privileged lives, so therefore they must have little knowledge to offer. They must need to be changed, and only I was capable of creating this change. I was the giver of knowledge, and they were the receiver. But far from being a blank slate, the community had a rich perspective to offer. A rich perspective rooted in traditions spanning centuries. I was learning something from this worldview. I was becoming the student, and the community was becoming my teacher. I was changing, and the community was the one inspiring this change. And with that change came this epiphany, that before I could serve, I had to learn. The power of that epiphany erased the line I had drawn. I no longer could see the community as separate from me, just because we were different. I no longer could make assumptions based on our different backgrounds. I saw them as a partner who could impact me just as much as I hoped to impact them. I found that my vision for improving the community was shared by those within it. And in that common cause, I discovered a reason to see myself in the other. I realized that my people were not just those with whom I shared an American passport. My people included these individuals with whom I didn't share a country, a culture, or an appearance, but with whom I shared a vision and a set of values. I realized that the bond forged on unifying purpose is so much stronger than the one we so often fabricate based on one facet of our identity. And so, despite the gap in privilege and opportunity, people whom I once saw as the other became my people. It almost didn't turn out that way. I almost allowed our outward differences to blind me. I almost deluded myself into believing that different means other, that just because we were different, we must be separate. But I was able to find a better path, because I let myself reconsider my assumptions. I didn't let my fear of the other become an obstacle to asking questions. I engaged in conversation to discover a common cause. The associate behind that counter, the parent at that soccer game, my friend, could also have recognized that our different appearances didn't mean we couldn't share a common language, a common pastime, a common passion, or a common aspiration. They too could have realized that different does not mean other. In this world where differences continue to be sources of discord and division, what better common cause can we find than breaking this cycle where different means other? What better cause can empower us to redefine my people, your people, our people, than the common cause of not repeating our tragic history? What better common cause than writing a new story, a shared story where my struggles are your struggles, and your struggles are mine, where we understand that Islamophobia, terrorism, and so many other societal ills of our time stem from that same fear of difference. When I stand for justice, I stand against each of those products of injustice, not just the one that happens to affect me today. Islamophobia is just one of my many concerns. For while we may not share the same house of worship or the same appearance, we share a common human history. And our children will share a common human destiny. To turn this page in history, it is time we start not just tolerating the other, but engaging with the other. Not just understanding the other, but no longer seeing them as the other. Thank you.